So today, I'd like you to kind of have at the ready Matthew 24 and 25. And I have to admit, Matthew 24 is one of those parts of the Bible that I find actually rather stressful to lead a discussion on because it's unashamedly apocalyptic. And when that kind of literature comes around, people tend to go a little crazy. And being the facilitator in such a discussion is like being a moving target. But it is good for us to read it because it is scripture. So here goes. But before we plunge into it, I should like to start with a warning. You know how you open up a piece of equipment and sometimes you'll get this long brochure that says all the things that it's not meant to do and you shouldn't try to do with it. And don't iron your clothes while you're wearing them. Don't use your push lawnmower as a hedge trimmer. This kind of thing. I would like to start Matthew 24 with that kind of disclaimer. It is very, very important to read this with context in mind. The immediate context, end of Matthew 23, beginning of Matthew 24, and the general context of apocalyptic prophecy in the Old Testament and the New Testament. For example, immediate context starts with Jesus walking out of the temple, having just declared a series of woes against the scribes and the Pharisees, the hypocritical religious leaders. And that ended with a warning that said, I will send you prophets and wise men and scribes, some of whom you will kill and crucify, some you will flog in your synagogues and persecute from town to town, so that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on earth. And a lament, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to you. How often would I have gathered you? See, your house is left desolate to you. This is all very classic prophetic language of judgment. So as they're walking out, and his disciples are oohing and eyeing over the magnificence of the temple complex, Jesus says to them, all of this you're looking at, there will not be left here one stone upon another. It will all be thrown down. So as they go out and they sit on the Mount of Olives, his disciples come to him and privately ask him a two-part question. When will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the close of the age, the end of the age? Now you have to read what follows as an answer, a reply to that two-part question. So there's a lot of stuff mixed together here. There is the judgment spoken over Jerusalem. There is the prophecy of the temple being destroyed. They're asking, when will these things take place? And they're asking the sign of your coming. Now, I don't believe that they actually knew at this point that they were talking about the coming at the end of the world. Jesus' second coming for judgment when all has taken place. I'm pretty sure they were thinking of saying, when will you take charge here, as you so rightfully should, if you are the Christ, the Son of the living God? And the end of the age, probably, I'm not even sure what they're talking about there, but I really doubt they were talking the end of the world. The pre-Messianic age, that should end when the Messiah comes. So when will this happen? The problem when we forget the context on a passage like this is that we risk trading orthodoxy for mere dogmatism. Now, if you look up dogmatism in the dictionary, you will find something like this: unfounded positiveness in matters of opinion, or arrogant assertion of opinions as truths. What happens when you forget the context, and I know there will be people who will not like to hear this, you will end up with something like the LaHaye Jenkins Left Behind series, which has caused a lot of people to take speculations about end times and a fantasy series, fiction series, emphasis on fiction, as a news report, like this is how it's going to be. When you don't know, just say you don't know. We'll come back to that later. That is why I would like to begin with the warning that we have to keep in mind what Jesus is answering here. And also the nature of apocalyptic prophecy in Scripture to be, in general, that it is layered. It is often fulfilled in multiple times. There may be an immediate fulfillment, but not a complete fulfillment at that time. The complete fulfillment may point to something in the distant future. We don't know. So when he starts to answer the question, I think it's kind of telling that Jesus begins with his own warning. See that no one leads you astray. For many will come in my name saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. And you'll hear of wars, of rumors of wars. You will hear all of these things that we consider end times signs. Wars, rumors of wars, earthquakes, famines. And he says, these things, they're just the beginning of the birth pains. That also is another metaphor that prophets use for tribulation. Because he says all of these things that are like global level that people tend to think of as, well, in many cultures, signs of judgment from the gods, an earthquake, a famine, all these sort of things, a war. He says that's just the beginning. And it goes on. It's like tribulation, persecution, apostasy, false teaching, lawlessness. These things are progressive signs that something is coming. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Did you hear the sequence in that? The gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed to the whole world, and then the end will come. Which does suggest, as a side note, that if you really do want to see Christ return, there's something you ought to be doing. It doesn't mean that the gospel of the kingdom will be accepted throughout the whole world, but it must be proclaimed so that no one is left without excuse. But these are all things that are general. These are the things we don't know. And a lot of this does refer to their question, when will these things be? When is the judgment on Jerusalem going to come? When will the temple be destroyed? And this is another one of those layers of fulfillment. Now, there were some who thought, right? Let me back up a second. The prophet Daniel mentioned something mysterious called the abomination of desolation. It's a mouthful, and no one really knows what it means. And it had been thought that Daniel's prophecy was fulfilled most fully, not in its entirety, but most fully in 167 BC. So we're talking about, almost 200 years before Jesus is talking here. When a man called Antiochus Epiphanes entered the temple, ordered that an altar to Zeus be erected, that pigs and other unclean animals be sacrificed there, and that other blatant violations of the law be made in order to defile the temple and destroy the identity of the Jewish people. They were thinking, okay, this guy must be that one that Daniel was talking about. But suddenly, Matthew 24:15, we see Jesus saying, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place. And I love the parentheses here. Let the reader understand. It's like, I wish I did. He says, when you see this, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. And at the time, 70 AD, when Jerusalem was being attacked, this was fulfilled. That the believers who still lived in Judea went and hid themselves in the remotest mountain reaches they could, because they had been warned here, when you see the temple being defiled again. And a lot of them survived the destruction of Jerusalem, whereas a lot of the Jewish people died. But there are, again, like I said, layers of prophecy where every partial fulfillment seems to point to something else, seems to point to the end. Like the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple precinct, a reminder that the powers of this world, the powers that be, will always seek to destroy what is holy to God, whether that's a physical place of worship or the church members as mortal people, or the identity of the church within a culture. And we see this today. Excuse me. Where in many places in the world, if Christians are found to be worshiping somewhere, that place is often seized, burned down, in some way made unavailable, or you might say desecrated. The people themselves are, as the warning was, persecuted from town to town. Or that the identity of believers comes under attack. And we shouldn't be surprised by this, because this is how the last days work. In the case of Jerusalem, he was talking about, pray that it doesn't happen in the winter or on a Sabbath, because it's going to be terrible. And the mixture here of short-term fulfillment and long-term fulfillment gets very confusing, as he talks about, if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Is he talking about when the Romans were destroying Jerusalem? Or is he talking about some other time when the people of God will be hunted? And he uses the language of the Old Testament prophets. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, powers of heaven will be shaken. These are all terms that have been used fairly frequently in the Old Testament, talking about the day of the Lord, which is its own study by itself. We can't even hope to cover it right now. But there are, again, a day of the Lord mentions, and then there are the day of the Lord mentions. And in this case, he's talking about sending out angels with a loud trumpet call to gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to another. This one sounds very much like the day of the Lord. And of course, what comes to mind when he's talking about this is, okay, how do we know when this is going to happen? Because I don't think this is included in their question at the beginning. I'm pretty sure they were thinking at this point, when? Could you give us a time frame? Because this sounds really, really horrible. And he says, you see a fig tree, you see the branch becoming tender, and it puts out leaves, and summer is at hand. So also, when you see all these things happen, he's near. And one of the most troublesome parts of this is that he says, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. And there have been a lot of people trying to make sense of this because obviously that generation was a long time ago and the world has continued on. In decline, true, and there have been many attempts to figure this part out because it's like, well, I'm thinking probably he's talking about the 70 AD destruction, that these things is what he's talking about there. But there have been people who have gone so far to try to make sense of this as to say that maybe John, the Apostle John, the one who lasted the longest, lived to the oldest age, maybe he never died. And you get this at the end of the Gospel of John, where they're like, the rumor started that he wasn't going to die. And he himself was like, and that's not what he said about me. But the rumor persisted. I find very encouraging then that right after this, he assures them, A, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. And B, concerning that day and hour, nobody knows. Not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, which is a problem for a lot of people, but the Father only. There are some who say that this is evidence of the limitation of the Son, that he did not know all things as God in flesh. I tend to think of it more as the submission of the Son to the Father. He knew the hearts of men. He knew the time of his own mission. And he seems to just say, that's good enough. I will leave the rest in the Father's hands, which is a good example for us, because we do get so distracted trying to work out timetables. But of all the things we don't know and can't really be positive about in this passage, there are certain things we know for sure. The first one is be ready whenever. He talks about, as in the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man, right? You think about Noah. It took him years to build the ark in a culture that had never known even rain, let alone flooding. And he talks about how everybody went on as they had always, eating, drinking, marrying, given in marriage, until the day came when Noah walked into the ark and bam, the flood hit and all was wiped out. He's like, that's how it's going to be at the coming of the Son of Man. Not that there won't be any warning, but it'll be sudden. And he gives a warning, stay awake, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. But know this, that if the master of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have thrown him a party. My paraphrase, of course, but he would have stayed awake and not let his house be broken into. Therefore, you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. And he talks about the faithful and wise servant. And this is a word to those who are in some form of leadership position in the body of Christ. He says, the master has set you over the household to give them their food at the proper time. He says, blessed is that servant whom his master will find so doing when he comes. But another thing we do know is that he's not going to return in secret. If we back up a little bit to verses like 23 and forward, he's saying, if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or there he is, don't believe them, because when he comes, you will know. It'll be as visible as lightning in the sky. You don't have to actually be at the spot where lightning strikes in order to see it. In fact, it's better not to be, but that's a different subject. He says, and just like wherever there's a carcass out in the wilderness, you know where it is because you see the carrion birds circling above it. You know when certain things happen without being on the spot. And in the same way, it will not be a secretive return. You won't have to hunt him out, search for him. He will just be there and you will know. And that's why you have to be ready. You have to be focused, confident that it will come anytime, and behaving in a fitting manner. That's the other thing we know. He says, do the work to make ready for the return. We have a series of parables that he tells. After he talks about, this stewardship in the house, being ready, taking care of the household, making sure that everyone is fed and clothed, instead of, and he gives a contrast here, the wicked steward who says, my master is delayed, and then starts to beat his fellow servants and goes out eating and drinking and is caught off guard. He also says that this return, this kingdom of heaven return, will be as 10 maids of honor at a wedding. Apparently, we don't start early enough with weddings. We have here a picture of 10 young ladies camped out outside the wedding venue, as it were, waiting for the bridegroom to come and the door be opened and the party to start. But 5 of them came prepared. They're like, all right, this could go late. I brought a lamp. I brought oil for my lamp. I am ready. The others are like, this might go late, but probably not too late. So they brought the lamp, no oil, no refill. And they all became drowsy and slept. But at midnight, there was a cry, here comes the bridegroom, come out to meet him. And they all got up and they're taking care of their lamps. Let's turn up the light a little bit. And the ones are like, oh, I'm running a little low. Have you got some to spare? I'm like, no, I brought enough for myself. Go get some for yourself. So the 5 that weren't prepared ran off to go and find some more oil because, we got to have light for this. And while they're gone, the bridegroom comes. Those who were ready go in with him. The door is shut. Those who were not ready, yeah, doesn't matter how hard they knock or how loud they shout, they weren't there. So they don't go in. Another parable. Man goes on a journey, calls his servants, and entrusted them with his property. And he gives a fairly sizable amount of money to one, a moderate amount to another, and just a little to the third, each according to his ability. And he went away, and the servants are left to do what they can with what they've been entrusted with. And the one who was given much, he went out and he doubled it. The one who was given a moderate amount, same, went out, doubled it. The one who was given just a little went out and buried it, right? We know this parable. And the problem is that all three started out as servants equally in the house, but they end, two go in, one's thrown out. Because he didn't take care of the master's property. He didn't do the work to prepare for the master's return. And he ends with this image of the Son of Man coming in glory with all his angels and gathering before him all the nations to separate them out. Sheep, goats. Those who get to come in, those who get thrown out. And the criteria he gives in this story is whether or not you saw who was hungry and fed them, who was thirsty, gave them drink, showed hospitality to strangers, clothed the naked, visited the sick and the imprisoned. Because every time you do this to one of the least, he says, of my brothers, you did it to me. And the others, right? When did we see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick or in prison and did not minister to you? No, this never happened. I don't remember this at all. He says, yeah, you didn't do this to one of the least of these, my brothers. It's implied. And that is a really sour note to end a story on. But it's a terrifying note to end a life on. The implication, as far as I can see, is that the more we proclaim the gospel and the more we care for the needs of those around us, the sooner the return comes. Now, we could discuss this at length, and we probably should. But we are on a limited time schedule right now. So next week, we will hit chapters 26 and 27. The plot, the Passover, the arrest, crucifixion, and the burial. Hope to see you then.